Have you ever woken up to the sound of silence that feels too loud? That moment when the morning light touches your face, and for a split second, you wonder why the house feels different. Then you remember they're gone. Not gone in the way that brings grief, but gone in the way that leaves space, too much space. The children who once filled every corner with laughter, arguments, endless questions, and breathless stories have stepped into their own lives, leaving you standing in the doorway of yours. You know, I remember the first week after my last child left home, how I'd catch myself setting that extra plate at dinner, or calling out their name before remembering the emptiness that answered back. There's something about a mother's heart that doesn't quite understand time and space, how we can intellectually know they're gone, but our souls keep expecting them around every corner. I found myself walking past their bedrooms, those sacred spaces that held whispered secrets and midnight tears. Doorways that once couldn't contain their energy now framed nothing but still air and memories. I'd stand there, hand on the doorframe, feeling like an intruder in the museum of what used to be. There's a particular kind of silence that comes when children leave. It's not just the absence of noise, it's the absence of expectation. For 20, 30 years, your ears were tuned to certain frequencies. The sound of their key in the door, the particular way they'd clear their throat when they needed something, the rhythm of their footsteps coming down the stairs. Now, the house speaks differently. The refrigerator hums louder. The floorboards creak with intention. The walls seem to expand, making rooms feel both larger and emptier than they ever were before. And your voice echoes in ways it never did when it had to rise above the beautiful chaos of raising children. Some nights, I'd find myself turning up the television, not to hear the program, but simply to feel the company of human voices. Other times, I'd play their favorite songs, as if the music might summon some essence of them back into the room. We do these things not because we're broken, but because we're learning a new language, the dialect of absence. You see, the silence after children leave isn't empty, it's full of echoes. Every room holds conversations you once had, arguments you wish you'd handled differently, moments of tenderness that passed too quickly. The echo of who you were as a mother reverberates against the question of who you are now. I remember sitting at my kitchen table one morning, 3 weeks after my son left for college, stirring coffee I wasn't drinking, when I realized I was mourning. Not for my children. They were alive and well and becoming exactly who they were meant to be. I was mourning for the woman I had been, the mother whose hands were always full, whose mind was always divided, whose heart was always stretched between her own needs and theirs. There's wisdom in that mourning, a recognition that something precious has ended, making space for something new to begin. The Japanese have a word for this, mono no aware, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, the understanding that life's most beautiful moments are touched by the gentle shadow of their passing. You know, there's a curious thing about emptiness. It has weight. I never understood that until my children left. How something not there could feel so heavy, pressing down on ordinary moments throughout the day. That load of laundry suddenly half its size, grocery lists shrinking, meals simplified. The physical evidence of absence accumulates in the smallest ways. I remember standing in the cereal aisle, staring at boxes I no longer needed to buy, and feeling tears well up. Not because I missed buying sugary cereal, heaven knows I'd complained about that expense enough, but because each item not placed in my cart was a reminder. One less person to feed, one less person to care for, one less person needing me in that primal, everyday way that had defined my purpose for so long. We don't talk enough about this, how motherhood becomes not just what we do, but who we are, how we learn to navigate the world with our hearts walking around outside our bodies. And when those hearts grow legs strong enough to carry them away from us, we're left holding a map to a landscape that no longer exists. Some days, The absence feels like freedom. I'd wake up and realize I could do anything, anything at all, without considering another soul's schedule or needs or moods. I could eat ice cream for breakfast, stay up all night reading, leave dishes in the sink. Small rebellions that made me giggle like a schoolgirl playing hooky. But other days, that same freedom felt like abandonment. Not by my children, but by the structure that had held me together for decades. The scaffolding of motherhood, school schedules, and doctor appointments and homework supervision had been dismantled, and I wasn't sure if the building underneath was still standing. That's the weight we don't expect, the heaviness of our own untethered selves, suddenly having to answer questions we'd put aside for years. What brings me joy? What do I want? Who am I when I'm not somebody's mother? I found myself pulling out old journals, reading entries from before children came, looking for clues to who I had been, like an archaeologist studying artifacts from a civilization long buried. Sometimes I'd recognize that woman. Other times she seemed like a stranger, so certain of things I'd long forgotten to care about. There's a particular kind of courage required to stand beneath the weight of absence, to resist the urge to fill all the empty spaces immediately, to allow yourself to feel the full pressure of this transition. Because it's in that pressure, like carbon becoming diamond, that we begin to transform. I started leaving rooms empty sometimes, not turning on lights or music or television, just sitting with the absence, acknowledging its presence in my life. Not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a teacher who had something important to tell me. If only I could learn to listen. The weight doesn't disappear overnight, but gradually you learn to carry it differently, to understand that this heaviness is not a burden, it's ballast, keeping you grounded as you navigate new waters, preventing you from being carried away by the first current that comes along. Have you noticed how memories have a way of becoming physical things in an empty house? How you can walk through a room and suddenly feel the presence of a moment that happened years ago? I've found myself stopping mid-step, caught in the ghost light of remembering. My son studying at the kitchen table, head bent over books, that one lock of hair falling across his forehead. My daughter dancing through the living room, teaching herself moves she'd seen on television, unaware I was watching from the doorway. These shadows of what used to be, they follow us through the rooms of our emptied nests. Sometimes they bring comfort, these phantom presences. Other times they bring a peculiar kind of pain, not the sharp sting of grief, but the dull ache of knowing we can never go back. I remember folding laundry one afternoon, how my hands still expected their clothes, how my fingers still searched for their sizes. 25 years of muscle memory doesn't fade quickly. And for a moment, I felt angry. Not at them for growing up in a way, that was always the goal, wasn't it? But angry at time itself, for its relentless forward motion, for not allowing us to keep even one moment perfectly preserved. We take so many photographs as mothers, filling albums and phones and clouds with frozen seconds. First steps, lost teeth, graduation gowns. But we can't capture the feeling of small fingers wrapped around one of ours, the weight of a sleeping child on our chest, the particular way they smelled after bath time. These sensations live only in our bodies, these shadows that follow us from room to room. Sometimes I find myself touching door frames where we marked their heights, running my fingers over the scratches they left on the coffee table, pressing my palm against the dent in the wall from that time the baseball came through the window, physical evidence that they were here, that I didn't dream them. There's a tenderness required to live among these shadows, a willingness to acknowledge both their beauty and their capacity to wound. Some days, I'd find myself avoiding certain rooms entirely, the places where the shadows gathered most densely. Other days, I'd seek them out, sitting in their midst like someone visiting a favorite museum. This, too, is part of the journey, learning to coexist with the ghosts of motherhood past. Not exercising them or clinging to them, but allowing them to take their proper place in your story. Shadows are created when something blocks the light, but they also prove that light exists, that something substantial stood in its path. I began, slowly, to see these shadows differently, not as painful reminders of what was lost, but as evidence of what had been accomplished. Each phantom presence testified to a human being successfully launched into the world. Each memory was proof of a job, the most important job, done well enough that they could leave. The shadows where they used to stand began to feel less like absences and more like legacies. Not empty spaces, but foundations upon which new stories could be built. Their stories continuing elsewhere, my story continuing here, connected by invisible threads stronger than distance or time could ever break. It's strange how we forget our own voices in the symphony of raising children. How the constant questions of, "Mom, where is my?" and "Mom, can you?" and "Mom, I need," become the dominant melody of our days. For decades, your own thoughts swim beneath the surface of immediate needs and urgent demands, coming up for air in rare moments of solitude. And then, suddenly, the chorus fades. The questions stop, the house grows quiet, and there you are, face to face with a woman you vaguely remember, yourself. I recall standing in my bathroom mirror about 2 months after my youngest left, really looking at myself, perhaps for the first time in years, not checking for food stains before rushing to a meeting, not applying quick makeup between dropping off and picking up, just looking. And I asked myself, well, hello there, what do you want now? The question hung in the air, unanswered. I had forgotten how to speak the language of my own desires, how to translate the whispers of my soul into words my conscious mind could understand. It was like trying to recall a dialect from childhood, familiar yet strangely inaccessible. This is the secret task of the empty nest, relearning yourself, excavating passions buried beneath years of prioritizing others, remembering dreams deferred but not forgotten. Finding the woman who existed before motherhood and inviting her into conversation with the woman you've become. I began by asking simple questions. What foods do I actually like when I'm not accommodating everyone else's preferences? What time do I naturally wake up when not set to someone else's schedule? What colors bring me joy? What music moves me? These weren't trivial inquiries. They were breadcrumbs leading me back to myself. Sometimes the answers surprised me. Tastes had changed. Interests had evolved. The young woman who once dreamed of traveling the world had become someone who found profound satisfaction in tending her garden. The girl who avoided silence now craved it like water. We changed through the years of motherhood, not just our bodies, but our souls. Other discoveries felt like reuniting with an old friend. Books I'd once loved still spoke to me. The feeling of clay between my fingers still awakened something primal and true. My love for dawn light streaming through windows hadn't dimmed with time. These continuities became anchors as I navigated the unfamiliar waters of self-rediscovery. There's tenderness required in this process. Patience with yourself as you stumble through the forgotten language of self. Some days the words come easily. Other days you sit in frustrated silence, unable to articulate what you need or want or feel. This too is sacred work. I started keeping a small notebook by my bed. Each night before sleep I'd write one sentence beginning with "I want," or "I love," or "I wonder." No judgments. No practical considerations, just the raw, unfiltered voice of my rediscovered self, growing stronger with each entry. This is how we rebuild fluency in our own language, one honest sentence at a time. One choice made not for someone else's benefit, but for our own. One moment of listening to the voice that's been whispering beneath the beautiful chaos of motherhood for all these years. The forgotten language of self isn't really forgotten, you see. It's just been waiting patiently for its turn to be spoken again. And now, in the quiet of your empty nest, It rises like a song remembered from childhood, familiar and strange and exactly what your heart has been longing to hear. The stillness comes first, then the ripples. That's what I've learned about this season of life. After the initial shock of emptiness, after the echoing rooms and the weighted absence and the shadowed memories, there comes a peculiar stillness. A cessation of the constant motion that defined motherhood. No more rushing between activities, no more coordinating schedules, no more mediating conflicts, just stillness. At first, this stillness feels like failure, like something has gone terribly wrong with the machinery of your life. You find yourself standing in the kitchen at odd hours, unsure why you came, what you needed, your body still operating on old rhythms that no longer serve any purpose. I remember a Sunday afternoon about 3 months after my children had gone. I sat on the porch swing, a book unopened in my lap, watching clouds drift across the autumn sky. 2 hours passed this way, just sitting, just being. And suddenly I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd done nothing without feeling guilty about it. That's when the first ripple started. A small disturbance in the still waters of my new life. A thought, what if this emptiness isn't emptiness at all? What if it's space? Space created for something new to emerge. The ripples begin small like that, quiet questions that disturb the surface of your carefully maintained composure. Subtle shifts in how you perceive this chapter of your story. The narrative changes from one of loss to one of possibility, not overnight, not without resistance, but gradually, persistently, like water finding its level. I started noticing other ripples too, emotions I hadn't allowed myself to feel during active motherhood, anger about opportunities set aside, resentment about sacrifices unacknowledged, grief for versions of myself that never had the chance to fully exist. These feelings weren't pretty or comfortable, but they were honest. And honesty creates movement in still waters. There were unexpected ripples of joy, too. The rediscovery of small pleasures, reading until dawn without worry about functioning the next day. Spontaneous day trips without coordinating multiple schedules. Cooking elaborate meals simply because they brought satisfaction, not because they needed to please various palates. Each choice, each feeling, each small act of self-reclamation sends ripples outward across the surface of this new life. Sometimes these ripples intersect and amplify each other. Sometimes they cancel each other out, but always they are evidence of life continuing, of movement beneath the apparent stillness. I found myself journaling one evening. The children aren't the only ones who got to leave home. In some ways, I've left too, left behind the version of myself defined solely by their needs. Stepped away from the woman whose worth was measured by lunches packed and tears dried and homework supervised. That thought sent one of the largest ripples of all, the realization that empty nests aren't just about children flying away. They're about mothers being released from certain kinds of gravity that have held them in place, not all at once, not completely, but enough to create new patterns of movement. The still waters of this life after active motherhood aren't meant to remain undisturbed. They're meant to be touched by the wind of new ideas, stirred by the reaching roots of old dreams, moved by currents of reinvention. Each ripple, a conversation between who you've been and who you're becoming. So I've learned to welcome them, these ripples in still waters, to see them not as disruptions of a peaceful surface, but as evidence of life continuing to unfold beneath it. Each concentric circle moving outward from its center, touching shores I couldn't see before. There comes a time in this journey when you begin to realize just how scattered you've become. How motherhood required you to distribute your energy, your attention, your very self across so many different needs and moments. A piece of your heart went to school with each child every morning. Another piece stayed home worrying. Another planned dinner. Another remembered dentist appointments. You became a beautiful mosaic of divided attention. And now, in the quiet of your empty nest, you have the chance to gather these scattered pieces of yourself, to call them back from all the places they've been assigned, to hold them in your hands and ask, which of these still belong to me? Which can I reclaim? Which should I release? I remember sitting at my dining room table with photographs spread before me. Pictures of myself at different ages, in different roles, before children, as a new mother, the field trip chaperone, the homework helper, the audience member at endless recitals. Looking at these images, I wondered, who am I when all these roles are completed? What remains at the core? This gathering is sacred work. It requires gentle hands and a forgiving heart. Because some pieces will be worn from overuse, the nurturer who never rested, the mediator who solved every conflict, the scheduler who kept all the trains running on time. These pieces may need to rest before they can be integrated again. Other fragments will feel unfamiliar, dreams so long deferred you barely recognize them as your own. Passions set aside for someday that feel awkward to reclaim now. Talents that atrophied while you developed the 1,000 skills motherhood required. These pieces need patience as they awaken again. I started this gathering with small rituals. Each morning I'd light a candle and speak aloud one quality I wanted to reclaim. Today, I call back my creativity. Today, I call back my sense of adventure. Today, I call back my right to change my mind. Small invocations that created space for these scattered aspects to return. There's a particular joy in this gathering, discovering that certain pieces have grown stronger through motherhood. The resilience that carried you through sleepless nights and teenage drama. The wisdom earned through navigating 1,000 family challenges. The deeper capacity for love that only comes from having your heart broken open again and again by the beautiful vulnerability of raising children. But there's grief too. Some pieces won't be coming back. The young woman with unlimited energy and uncarved time. The mother of small children needed in that primal, physical way that shaped your days and gave them meaning. The central hub around which a family orbited. These fragments belong to the past now, to be honored but not reclaimed. This gathering isn't about becoming who you were before motherhood. It's about creating something new from all you've been and all you've learned. An integration of the maiden, the mother, and now the wise woman who carries both these previous selves within her. I found myself writing letters to the scattered pieces of myself, inviting some to come forward and take central roles in this next chapter, thanking others for their service and releasing them with gratitude. This wasn't magical thinking. It was a concrete way of deciding who I wanted to be now, which qualities I wanted to nurture, which patterns I was ready to release. There's power in this gathering. In claiming authorship of your life again, in deciding which scattered pieces to polish and display prominently in the self you're becoming. The beautiful truth of the empty nest is that you get to decide. After decades of responding to others' needs first, you now have the freedom to reassemble according to your own design, like the Japanese art of kintsugi, mending broken pottery with gold. The gathered pieces of your post-motherhood self may show their seams. But these lines of reconnection don't diminish the vessel. They tell the story of what it has survived. They honor both the scattering and the gathering, making something more precious from the journey of both. Have you noticed how differently plants grow when they're not constantly touched? How a garden left to its own devices for a season will sometimes produce the most surprising blooms? There's wisdom in that observation for women in the empty nest. A reminder that growth often happens most profoundly in periods of quiet and apparent stillness. After the scattered pieces begin to gather, after the ripples disturb the still waters, there comes a time of germination. Seeds long dormant in your soul, dreams set aside, curiosities unexplored, questions unanswered, finally find the space and silence they need to push through the soil of your consciousness. I remember waking one morning with an inexplicable urge to paint. Not that I'd ever been particularly artistic or even enjoyed painting in my youth, but there it was, this persistent internal whisper saying, "Buy canvas, buy colors, see what happens." For weeks, I ignored it, filing it under random thoughts and midlife restlessness. But it persisted, growing stronger in the silence of my uncluttered days. That's how it begins, this garden of self that grows in the silence after children leave. Not with grand visions or 5-year plans, but with quiet, persistent nudges from some deeper part of yourself. A paragraph in a book that won't leave you alone. A chance comment from a friend that echoes in your mind for days. A dream that returns night after night, offering variations on the same theme. These are the seeds. And the silence of the empty nest provides the perfect conditions for them to germinate. I finally bought those paints, set up a small table by the window where the morning light was kind, made awkward strokes that pleased no one, least of all myself. But something inside me settled as I watched colors blend on canvas. Some nameless restlessness found expression, not in masterpieces, but in the simple act of following an intuition that had no practical purpose except that it brought me alive. That's the secret of this garden. It doesn't grow according to anyone else's timetable or aesthetic. It doesn't need to produce anything marketable or impressive. It grows simply because it must, because life always seeks expression, because 20 or 30 years of focusing primarily on others creates a reservoir of self that eventually must find release. Some days, nothing seems to grow. The soil of your life feels barren, the silence oppressive rather than nurturing. This too is part of the cycle. Even the most fertile gardens have fallow seasons, times of apparent dormancy that are actually periods of essential rest, of nutrients being restored, of deeper roots forming beneath the surface. I learned to trust these fallow times, to resist the urge to force growth or manufacture purpose, to understand that after decades of productivity defined by others' needs, my soul needed to establish its own rhythms. Some days that meant accomplishing nothing more than watching clouds form and dissipate. Other days it meant furious activity driven by inspiration that seemed to arrive from nowhere. There's an intimacy that develops in this relationship with your own becoming, a tenderness toward the vulnerable shoots of new interests, new perspectives, new ways of being in the world. You learn to protect these fragile growths from the harsh judgments of your own inner critic, that voice that asks, "What's the point of starting something new at your age?" Or, "Who do you think you are to want more than you've already had?" This garden of self requires regular tending, not with the desperate vigilance of new motherhood, but with the patient attention of a wiser cultivator, noticing what thrives and what struggles, providing nourishment where it's needed, occasionally pruning back aspects that have served their purpose and now take energy from new growth. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, blossoms begin to appear. Not the dramatic flowering of youth with its vivid colors and bold statements, but the more subtle, complex blooms of a woman coming into her fullness, wisdom that could only develop through living, compassion deepened by loss, joy made more precious by the awareness of time's passage. This is the garden that grows in the silence after children leave, not despite their absence, but because of the space that absence creates. A garden not of your youth, but of your becoming. And like all true gardens, it's never finished, never perfect, always evolving with the seasons of your life. There's a particular kind of reckoning that happens in the empty nest, a meeting with your own shadow, not shadow as darkness, but shadow as depth. Those aspects of yourself you couldn't afford to face while raising children. The complexities you set aside while presenting a more unified self to the family that needed your strength. I remember the day my shadow self came calling. I was organizing old photographs, sorting them into albums, a task long postponed during busy years. There, among the smiling birthday parties and beach vacations, I found a picture of myself from before children, standing on a mountain overlook, arms outstretched, face turned toward an impossible sky. The look in my eyes struck me like a physical blow. Wild freedom, untamed joy, limitless possibility. And suddenly, I was weeping. Not gentle tears, but body-shaking sobs that came from some place I hadn't accessed in years. Grief not just for youth past, but for a self I'd carefully packed away. A woman who took risks, who didn't always know the responsible answer, who had dreams that couldn't fit into school schedules and suburban living rooms. That's when the shadow appears, when the carefully maintained persona of responsible motherhood begins to crack, revealing the more complex woman beneath, the one with her own darkness and light, the one with ambitions that have nothing to do with family success, the one with questions about roads not taken and choices that can't be unmade. Learning to dance with this shadow self is perhaps the most challenging and rewarding work of the empty nest. It requires courage to face the regrets that surface, the secret resentments, the buried anger, the grief for versions of yourself sacrificed on the altar of good mothering. I started keeping 2 journals, one for light, one for shadow. In the first, I recorded gratitude, small joys, everyday beauty. In the second, I gave voice to harder truths, times I'd felt erased, moments I'd chosen, family peace over personal authenticity, questions about whether the sacrifices had been worth the cost. Both journals were equally true, both necessary for wholeness. There's liberation in this dance with shadow, permission to be complicated again, to contain multitudes, as Whitman said. To acknowledge that being a good mother doesn't require being a simple or completely selfless one. To recognize that the example of wholeness, with all its messy complexity, might be the final and most important gift you give your adult children. Sometimes the shadow reveals unexpected treasures, strengths you didn't know you possessed until children pushed you to your limits, resilience forged in sleepless nights and teenage crises, wisdom earned through navigating the 1,000 daily challenges of raising humans. The shadow isn't all regret and loss. It also contains power you haven't fully claimed. This dance becomes more fluid with practice. You learn when to lead and when to follow, when to give voice to the shadow's concerns, and when to gently redirect its attention, when to dive deep into existential questions, and when to simply make a cup of tea and watch the birds at the feeder. The rhythm develops naturally as you reclaim your wholeness. I found myself having conversations with my reflection, not from madness, but from a desire to integrate the many selves I'd been and could yet become. What do you regret most? I'd ask the woman in the mirror. What makes you proudest? What do you want now with the time that remains? Simple questions that required complex answers. The most beautiful part of this dance with shadow is discovering you're not alone in it. That women throughout time have faced this reckoning after their primary caregiving years. That there's collective wisdom available in books, in friendships, in the quiet communion of women who understand without explanation what this passage requires. Gradually, the dance becomes less confrontational, less about facing off against neglected aspects of self, more about weaving them into a new whole. The responsible mother and the wild dreamer, the practical caretaker and the unapologetic seeker, the woman who sacrificed and the woman who now claims her right to choose herself, not as separate selves in conflict, but as integral aspects of one woman coming into her fullness. This is perhaps the most profound gift of the empty nest, the opportunity to dance with your shadow until it's no longer shadow at all. Until the divisions between who you were supposed to be and who you truly are dissolve into something more integrated, more honest, more completely alive. Have you ever held a bird's nest in your hands? Noticed how the hollow center is what makes it useful? There's a teaching there about how emptiness itself can be sacred, about how spaces cleared of their former purpose aren't vacant at all, but pregnant with possibility. After the first year of my empty nest, I began to see the hollow spaces differently. Not just the physical rooms now quiet, but the emotional chambers within me no longer filled with constant maternal vigilance. The calendar squares no longer crowded with others' activities. The mental bandwidth no longer consumed by the beautiful demands of raising children. These hollow spaces, they whispered something revolutionary. You don't have to fill us right away. You can let us breathe. You can let us teach you. I remember sitting in my daughter's former bedroom, now cleared of posters and clothing piles, just bare walls and empty drawers. I had plans to make it a sewing room, but something held me back from that immediate transformation. Some inner wisdom that said, wait, listen to what this emptiness has to tell you. That's when I began to understand the wisdom of hollow spaces, how they create acoustics for softer voices to be heard, the longings that couldn't compete with the urgent needs of family life, the questions about meaning and purpose that were luxury items during the busy years, the spiritual stirrings that required more silence than a household with children could provide. These hollow spaces become temples of possibility if we resist the urge to fill them too quickly, if we allow ourselves to inhabit the emptiness long enough to hear what it's trying to tell us. I started spending time each day in deliberate emptiness, sometimes in an uncluttered room, sometimes in nature where the vastness of sky created its own kind of hollow, sometimes in meditation, clearing my mind of its constant chatter. These practices weren't about finding answers. They were about creating space where new questions could arise. There's a particular kind of fear that arises in hollow spaces, the vertigo of unlimited choice after years of constrained options. The panic of facing an unscheduled afternoon when your identity has been built around productive busyness. The existential questions that rush in when the distractions of daily caregiving recede. I felt that fear, sitting in hollow rooms of both house and heart. But beneath the fear lay something precious: freedom. Not the abstract freedom of youth with its endless horizons, but a more grounded freedom, the freedom of a woman who knows her capabilities because she's been tested by life. The freedom of someone who has earned the right to choose what comes next. Hollow spaces teach patience too, the willingness to live with uncertainty while new purpose gestates. The ability to distinguish between genuine callings and mere distractions. The discernment to recognize which opportunities deserve your precious time and which are simply ways to avoid the sometimes uncomfortable emptiness. I found myself turning down invitations that would have once seemed flattering, saying no to commitments that would have filled time but not fed soul, creating boundaries around my newfound hollow spaces because I recognized their value, not as permanent conditions, but as necessary transitions between what had been and what was yet to become. There's wisdom in allowing these hollow spaces to reshape you, in recognizing that you are both the vessel and its contents, both the bird's nest and the possibility it cradles, both the woman who raised children and the woman now free to raise herself into a new becoming. The mystics of many traditions speak of divine emptiness, the clearing away of ego and expectation that allows something larger to manifest. Perhaps that's what the empty nest offers, beneath its initial loneliness and disorientation, a kind of sacred hollowing that creates space for deeper wisdom to emerge. Not wisdom you can claim to have created, but wisdom that arrives when you've prepared a place for it to dwell. I began keeping a small altar in one hollow corner of my home. Nothing elaborate, a candle, a stone from a meaningful place, a feather found on a morning walk. This became my physical reminder of the holy emptiness I was learning to honor, the visible symbol of invisible transformation happening in the hollow spaces of my life. This is perhaps the deepest teaching of the empty nest, That emptiness itself is not a problem to be solved, but a gift to be received. That the hollow places, tended with patience and curiosity, become not abandoned rooms, but sacred chambers where the next chapter of your story begins to write itself. There comes a morning, you won't recognize it at first, when you wake to sunlight touching your face, and your first thought isn't about absence. It isn't about who's missing from the rooms beyond your door. It isn't about the silence that once felt so foreign and uncomfortable. Your first thought is simply, I wonder what today will bring. And in that moment, without ceremony or declaration, a threshold is crossed. The empty nest is no longer defined by what has left, but by what is emerging, by who you are becoming in the space that has been cleared. I remember such a morning, about 18 months after my children had gone. The particular quality of spring light through curtains I had finally changed to colors I preferred. The contentment of stretching in sheets chosen solely for their feel against my skin. The pleasant anticipation of a day shaped by my own rhythms and purposes. It wasn't that I loved my children any less. It wasn't that I didn't miss certain aspects of motherhood's active years. But something fundamental had shifted. The center of gravity in my life had returned to my own being, not as an act of selfishness, but as a natural progression, as right and necessary as their own journey toward independence had been. This is the final gift of the empty nest, the gradual, almost imperceptible transformation from a space defined by absence to a life characterized by presence. Your presence to yourself. Your presence to possibilities that could not have taken root in soil too crowded with others' needs. The present relationship with adult children transforms too. No longer centered on daily care and guidance, but evolving into something equally precious, the deep satisfaction of watching them create their own lives. The conversations that grow richer when not interrupted by household management. The discovery of who they are becoming when not seen solely through the lens of who they've been to you. I found new rituals for these connections, not the rhythms of shared meals and carpools, but intentional reaching across distance, letters that required thought rather than quick text between activities, visits where we met as adults with separate lives, not as extensions of one household. Even the silences between communications took on new meaning, not absence of connection, but respect for separate journeys. There's a particular sweetness to this phase that I hadn't anticipated, the pleasure of seeing traits you've nurtured express themselves in adult contexts, the unexpected gift of their concern for your well-being after decades of the reverse, the profound joy of witnessing them make choices that reflect values absorbed through years under your roof. And there's sweetness too in your own unfurling, in pursuing interests without guilt or divided attention, in forming friendships based on current passions rather than shared carpooling duties, in rediscovering physical pleasures, from sleep uninterrupted by worry, to travel unbounded by school schedules, to intimacy not constrained by young ears down the hall. This new beginning isn't about erasing what came before. The landscape of your heart still contains the beautiful terrain of active motherhood, the peaks of joy, the valleys of concern, the winding paths of daily love expressed in lunches packed and tears dried. But beside this familiar territory, new continents emerge, unexplored regions of self, unclaimed areas of possibility, uncharted lands of becoming. I started marking these new beginnings with small ceremonies, planting a tree that would grow alongside this next chapter, writing intentions for the coming season during solstice or equinox, creating visual reminders of emerging dreams and placing them where morning light would touch them first. These weren't grand gestures, but quiet acknowledgments of continuity and change. The morning light on new beginnings has a particular quality, gentler than the harsh illumination of younger ambitions, warmer than the stark clarity of middle life responsibilities. It reveals not an unlimited horizon of possibilities, but a more defined landscape of meaningful choices. Not everything is possible at this stage, but what remains possible has been refined by experience into what is genuinely valuable. This is the wisdom of the empty nest, fully traversed. Understanding that this phase isn't just an ending disguised as a beginning, it is its own distinct season, with unique gifts and challenges. Not a pale shadow of what came before, but a necessary fulfillment of the cycle. The emptying that makes room for new fullness, the releasing that makes new embrace possible. I keep a small stone on my windowsill where morning light finds it first, smooth river rock shaped by decades of flowing water. A reminder that this emptiness too has been shaping me, smoothing rough edges, revealing essential form, preparing me for this moment of new beginning. For this morning when I wake and my first thought is not of who is missing, but of who is present, the woman who remains when the nest empties, the woman who has always been here through every season of giving and growing and letting go, the woman who now steps forward, shaped by all that has been, ready for all that will be, as morning light illuminates the path ahead. It's not the end. It's just the moment when you realize that the hollow spaces have their own kind of fullness, that the echoing rooms have become chambers where your voice has remembered its own music, that the path ahead, though walked alone, carries the strength of every step that brought you here. Rest in this knowledge, dear one. The empty nest isn't empty at all. It's filled with the invisible presence of love that continues beyond proximity, with wisdom earned through years of pouring out and now returning to source, with quiet joy that comes not despite the letting go, but because of it. This too is part of the journey, perhaps the most beautiful part of all.